Mason, your antique grid system belongs in a museum. Pack up your things now.
Strangely, the people who understand the least always speak the loudest.
Evan Lockridge. Our 38-year-old CEO didn't even wait for me to finish the sentence. He slammed his palm on the table and said, loud enough for the entire floor to hear, Mason, your antique grid system belongs in a museum. The room froze. 20 pairs of eyes darted between him and me, as if watching a slow-motion car crash they couldn't look away from. Even the projector flickered, like it was embarrassed for me. Let me pause for a heartbeat. Where are you listening from? And are you one of the 95% of you listening who haven't subscribed yet? If so, let's break that number right now, because every subscribe click is a nod of understanding. And sometimes, the quietest of thanks. Okay, back to the story. Across the table, Carter Wynn leaned back with a grin so smug it should have required a permit. He loved the spectacle, loved seeing the oldest engineer in the room turned into morning entertainment. And then there was CFO Talia Renshaw, giving me that quiet, satisfied stare, the kind people save for the moment they finally see a long-delayed plan fall perfectly into place. I didn't react. I didn't blink. If anything, I admired how efficiently Evan managed to turn a routine engineering briefing into a public execution. Years of corporate life had taught me one truth: humiliation is always delivered with a smile and an audience. Let's not drag this out, Evan continued, brushing imaginary dust from his suit sleeve. Solance is moving forward, and we can't do that with legacy systems or legacy people. Effective immediately, Mason Drake is being transitioned out. HR will escort you after the meeting. Escorted, as if I were some malfunctioning piece of hardware they needed to unplug before it caught fire. A few people gasped softly. Most pretended to study their laptops. Carter actually straightened his posture, like he'd just been promoted by proximity. Talia folded her hands with a small, almost polite nod, confirming what her eyes had already confessed she wanted this. But me? I felt the shock hit, sharp and cold, then settle into something tighter, something bitter, something quiet, something almost amused. Because if Evan had bothered to read a single line of the contract he'd just invoked, he would have known one thing. You don't fire the architect of your entire grid system at 9:50 and expect the lights to stay on. I walked out of Solance HQ without looking back, but the weight settled in my chest the moment the cold air hit me, instead of heading home. My feet carried me almost instinctively toward the old cafe 2 blocks down, the place with flickering neon and booths that sagged like they were tired of holding people's secrets. I hadn't been there in years. But the moment I pushed the door open, the smell of burnt espresso and overworked air vents wrapped around me like a familiar, slightly tragic blanket. I slipped into the same corner booth where I once spent 2 nights straight during the statewide blackout of 2014. Back then, the grid was collapsing mile by mile, and every traffic light, hospital generator, and security system was gasping for power. I remember spreading out papers across this table, rewiring the entire state's load-balancing protocol while half asleep and over-caffeinated. At dawn on the second day, when the lights finally came back across the valley, no one cheered. No parade, no headline, just a quick email. Good job. Team. And I'd missed my son's high school graduation for that, missed watching him walk across the stage, missed the photo, missed the ceremony entirely. I watched a shaky video later that night, sitting right here in this booth. The cafe closed around me. He told me he understood, but the look in his eyes said he wished I'd chosen differently. That memory alone should have been enough to keep me angry, but others followed, piling up like overdue bills. I remembered the day Carter Wynn borrowed my adaptive routing concept during a design sprint, presenting it as his flash of genius. I could have called him out in front of the entire engineering floor. Instead, I let it slide to keep the team together. He thanked me for being understanding, then later bragged about his innovation during the holiday party. Then there were the kids fresh out of grad school, the ones who called me the analog relic when they thought I couldn't hear. I laughed it off publicly, but it stung in the quiet moments. I had built the backbone of the very system they stood on, and yet, somehow, I'd turned invisible while they turned loud. I exhaled slowly, letting the bitterness settle, and just as the weight threatened to sink me deeper into that booth, another memory surfaced, unexpected and sharp. A night years ago, a bar downtown, my old attorney friend, Marcus Hale, leaning over his drink, telling me, File the provisional under your name. Mason. Trust me. Protect yourself. I hadn't thought about that conversation in more than a decade. But now, sitting alone in this cafe with humiliation still warm on my skin, I felt the spark of it, the one thing Evan, Talia, and Carter never expected: a forgotten piece of paperwork, and Marcus's knowing smile from all those years ago. I didn't stay at the cafe long after that memory hit me. Instead, I walked home with the kind of steady, controlled steps a man takes when he knows something important is trying to surface in his mind. By the time I reached my living room, the humiliation from the morning had cooled into something quieter, something sharper. I poured a glass of water, sat at my desk, and pulled out the old metal drawer where I kept the documents no one ever thinks they'll need again. Buried under tax records and outdated system diagrams was a thick folder labeled Solance Employment Agreement 2007. I hadn't opened it since the day I signed it, back when the company was still small enough that the CEO knew everyone's kids' names and we all ate pizza on folding tables during rollout nights. I laid the contract flat on my desk, smoothing the creases with the back of my hand. Then, with a slow breath, I began flipping through the pages, not looking for anything specific, just following an instinct that felt older than reason. Page after page passed in silence. And then, there it was. Section 14B, Intellectual Property Reversion Clause. The exact sentence read, "In the event of involuntary termination without cause, all rights to any unassigned intellectual property developed exclusively by the employee shall revert to the employee within 24 hours. I sat back in my chair, stunned not by the clause itself, but by the realization that it was still legally active. After 17 years, after 8 CFOs, after 3 mergers and countless reorganizations, somehow, no one had bothered to remove it, not even Talia Renshaw, and she should have known. Hell, she signed off on this agreement when she first joined Solance's finance division 12 years ago. But knowing Talia, she skimmed the first 2 lines, saw the words legacy agreement, and assumed the lawyers had cleaned everything up. She always preferred shortcuts to details. I couldn't help it. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. They dug this hole. They polished its edges, and then they proudly pushed me into it, unaware the floor belonged to me. But the real punch came when I opened my email out of habit. A calendar invite blinked at the top of the screen: federal demonstration prep tomorrow, 9:00 a.m. Mandatory. Of course, Solance's big moment with the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Grid Modernization demo, the one Evan bragged about for months, the one built entirely on the adaptive load routing algorithm I created, the same algorithm covered under Section 14B. My algorithm, my IP, my signature that never transferred. And tomorrow, Solance planned to present it to federal officials without owning a single legal right to use it. My humiliation from the morning melted away, replaced by a cold, clean clarity. Solance didn't just fire me. They had just scheduled their own execution. By the time I finished rereading Section 14B for the 3rd time, my phone buzzed so violently it nearly slid off the desk. At first, I thought it was a spam alert or some routine system notification, but when I grabbed it, the screen was overflowing with missed calls, messages, and emails, all time-stamped within the past 5 minutes, and all from Solance. Panic travels fast in corporate halls, faster than truth and 10 times faster than accountability. The first message came from Carter Wynn. Of course it did. Carter Mason. Please tell me this is some rumor. You didn't actually keep the IP rights, did you? The irony nearly knocked me over. The same kid who once bragged he would rewrite my entire architecture in 6 months was now typing like his job depended on me, which, technically, it did. I didn't reply, before I could even lock the screen. The phone began ringing again. Talia Renshaw, our CFO, for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. I let it ring, then the 4th time, then the 5th. On the 6th call, she finally left a voicemail, her usual icy composure cracking at the edges. Mason, call me back immediately. This is urgent, extremely urgent. I played it twice, not because I needed the information, but because the fear in her voice was the most honest thing she'd said to me in 12 years. I set the phone down and took a sip of water, watching the phone light up again and again on the table like a tiny, panicking animal. Then came a message from someone I didn't expect, Levi Ward, one of the junior engineers I'd mentored. Levi, I don't know what they did to you, but I believe you. The whole place is melting down. People are running between offices. Legal is shouting. Evan just told everyone to stay calm, but no one is calm. I exhaled, half amused, half sympathetic. I'd spent years being dismissed as the analog relic. Yet the moment my name appeared on a legal filing, the entire building apparently remembered I existed. Curious. I refreshed my inbox and there it was, a forwarded internal memo from someone anonymous. Subject, urgent, patent ownership query. From legal department to executive team. The email was frantic, full of red bullet points and escalating warnings. But the best part came at the bottom. CEO Lockridge has instructed all departments to ignore the issue for now. Ignore it. Ignore a federal-level IP dispute hours before a government demo. I laughed quiet, sharp, disbelieving. Evan wasn't a leader. He was a child covering his eyes and declaring the world gone. Meanwhile, the world was very much awake and spiraling as the notifications kept pouring in. I leaned back in my chair, strangely calm, watching Solance implode in real time from the outside. A front-row seat, no extra charge, by late afternoon. The chaos inside Solance had ripened into something heavier, something that felt less like panic and more like corporate dread. My phone had stopped buzzing for a moment, long enough for me to hear myself breathe. When the first email from a board liaison appeared in my inbox, the subject line said everything urgent clarification required. Immediately, I opened it out of curiosity, not obligation. The message was short, clipped, and trembling between the lines. The board, it seemed, had just learned something Evan had accidentally forgotten to mention. He'd fired the architect of the company's core system without notifying them. Worse, my name was now publicly listed on the USPTO as the sole legal owner of the IP they needed for tomorrow's federal demo. If corporate terror had a scent, I could almost smell it through the screen. Minutes later, another message arrived, this time forwarded from someone deep inside the executive floor. A screenshot of a boardroom chat thread, redacted poorly, as if secrecy had become optional under pressure. From what I could piece together, the board was livid, not confused, not curious, livid. CFO Talia Renshaw, in classic Talia fashion, immediately tried shifting the blame. She claimed Carter Wynn had provided the wrong filing dates. Carter, according to the thread, nearly fell out of his chair, insisting he'd only followed her instructions. The transcript read like two people trying to outrun a fire they had accidentally started together, and somewhere inside that growing storm, I found myself smiling just a small, private curve at the corner of my mouth, not out of spite, not even out of triumph, but because the entire world I'd given decades to was finally rotating back toward the truth I'd carried alone for years. They had dismissed me. They had replaced me. They had erased me from their hierarchy. But now they couldn't move an inch without my signature. As I sat there, the sun dipping low behind the blinds, my phone lit up again, this time with a number I recognized but had never expected to see on my screen. Howard Mercer, chairman of the board. I let it ring once, twice, just long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle. Then I answered. His voice came through tight, stripped of its usual polished confidence. "Mason," he said, "we've reviewed the USPTO records, and we've reviewed Evan's omissions. We need to speak with you. Tonight, there was no preamble, no negotiation, no attempt to soften the urgency. Just a man representing a collapsing company, speaking to the one person he now realized they should never have taken for granted. We need you," he repeated quietly. Immediately. The Granite Harbor Hotel wasn't the kind of place Solance ever used for meetings. It was discreet, dimly lit, and intentionally quiet, the kind of venue companies picked only when they were trying to hide a fire instead of put it out. When I stepped off the elevator and walked toward the private conference suite the board had reserved, I could already feel the tension pressing through the door like steam trapped behind metal. Inside, Evan Lockridge attempted to rise from his chair with the calm confidence of a man in control, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. CFO Talia Renshaw sat rigidly on his right, her blouse sticking to her back from sweat she was trying desperately to hide. And Carter Wynn, brilliant, arrogant, and suddenly very small, stared at me the way someone might look at a lawsuit wearing a suit. I closed the door gently behind me. The soft click sounded almost ceremonial. Mason Howard Mercer, the board chair, said with a stiff nod. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I took my seat intentionally slowly, measuring the room. No one spoke. They were waiting for me to break the silence, but I wanted them to feel it, the imbalance, the shift, the weight of everything they'd ignored for years finally settling on their shoulders. Evan swallowed first. We appreciate your time, he said, the rehearsed steadiness in his voice collapsing on the edges. There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding the IP filings. I raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Talia jumped in quickly. We believe the reversion clause can be reversed if you withdraw the notice, and if you do that, Mason, we can resolve this internally with what I asked. An apology, a handshake, another performance review where you pretend not to know what system keeps the entire state's grid stable? Carter looked down at the table. Evan bristled. Talia froze. I stayed still, calm, cold, controlled. Howard cleared his throat. Mason, what the executive team means is, we'd like you to retract the filing immediately so tomorrow's federal demonstration can proceed without incident. So let me summarize, I said, leaning forward. You fired me without understanding what you fired, and now you'd like me to undo the consequence of your own negligence. No one answered. For the first time all day, the anger I'd buried pressed against the surface, not hot or wild, but precise, a blade, not a flame. I breathed once, let it settle, and chose the moment to flip the balance. I'll retract the filing, I said finally. Evan exhaled loudly in relief. But, I continued, only under 4 conditions. 4 faces tightened. 1, I said, Solance purchases full licensing rights to my IP directly from me at market valuation. Howard nodded slowly. 2, the company publicly recognizes me as the sole architect of the grid routing system. Talia blinked hard. 3, I gain full technical oversight of every system that uses my engine. Silence thickened. And 4, I paused just long enough to feel the tension snap. Evan resigns tonight. The room went dead still. And for the first time all day, I was the only one breathing normally. For a long moment after I laid out my 4 conditions, no one breathed. It was as if the air itself refused to move until someone acknowledged the truth hanging in the room. Evan stared at me like I'd spoken in a language he'd never heard before, one where consequences actually existed. Talia looked between the board and Evan, silently calculating which side of the sinking ship she could still stand on. Carter tried to melt into his chair. Howard Mercer was the only one who didn't flinch. Evan, he finally said, voice grave, step outside with me. They moved toward the hallway, the door closing behind them with a thick, weighted thud. The muffled voices that followed were sharp, clipped, escalating. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew the script. Executives always think they can bargain with gravity until they realize they stepped off the building hours ago, when the door opened again. Evan's face was blotched red, eyes shining with a desperation he could no longer hide. He was holding a single-page document with trembling fingers. His resignation. Mason, he began. But his voice cracked and he swallowed hard. For a second, he looked less like a CEO and more like a child forced to admit the truth after being caught stealing. I never meant for it's fine, I said calmly. Just sign it. He blinked, stunned that I didn't want his apology. But apologies don't fix broken systems, contracts do. He lowered his head and scribbled his name. The pen scraped loudly against the paper, a sound that felt like justice being carved in ink. When he finished, he pushed the document toward Howard with a shaking hand, then sat down and buried his face in his palms. He cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just small. Broken sobs of a man realizing he had engineered his own collapse. I watched him for a moment, feeling no triumph, only a cool, distant clarity, agility. Huh, I murmured softly. Guess it didn't kick in fast enough. Talia attempted a last-ditch effort. Howard, maybe we can reconsider the number. Howard cut her off sharply. You enabled this mess. Sit down. Her lips tightened, and for once, she obeyed without protest. Howard then collected the resignation, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a leather folder before turning to me. Your conditions are accepted. All 4. There it was, the moment the weight lifted off my shoulders, the moment the years of dismissal, exploitation, and quiet sacrifice finally found balance. As the room exhaled in reluctant defeat, Howard gestured for me to step aside. When we reached the corner of the suite, he lowered his voice. Mason, he said. "Solance should have let you lead a decade ago. That was our mistake. It wasn't flattery. It was an overdue admission and a strangely liberating one, for the first time in years. I felt the ground beneath me shift in the right direction. Justice wasn't loud, it was steady. And tonight, it finally arrived. Morning came with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not nerves, just the steady, grounded feeling of someone finally standing on the right side of his own story. When I walked into the Solance auditorium for the federal demo, no one tried to stop me. My badge, once deactivated with humiliating efficiency, blinked green the moment I tapped it. Board override, a quiet acknowledgement of a very loud truth. Inside, the air carried the metallic tension of a courtroom before a verdict. Rows of federal officials filled the front seats. Department of Energy, Federal Grid Commission, 2 observers from Homeland Security, clipboards, laptops, sharp eyes. Behind them, engineers whispered nervously, glancing at me as if I were the only stabilizing force in a room full of fragile circuits. I took my place near the central console. No theatrics, no announcement, just presence calm, controlled, undeniable. At 8:57, the board members filed in, their faces tight but composed. Evan was nowhere near the front. He stood in the back, his posture stiff and small, trying to blend into shadows that refused to hide him. Talia sat 2 rows behind the officials, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white. No one greeted them. Everyone watched me. When the clock hit 9 o'clock, Reed Vance, the CTO, cleared his throat. "We're ready to begin the demonstration," he said, but his voice was directed at me, not the audience. I opened the authorization panel on the tablet. My signature, the one they had tried to erase 2 days ago, sat at the top of the licensing terms. I tapped once, confirmed. A soft, rising hum filled the room. Then, the LED wall exploded into motion, a cascading network of blue lines illuminating the entire map of the state's grid. Nodes pulsed, channels shifted, load routes recalibrated in real time with a precision no other system had ever accomplished publicly. The room leaned forward collectively, mesmerized. This wasn't just technology. It was orchestration, and I was the conductor. Reed narrated the system's behavior with newfound humility, explaining each layer of adaptive partitioning and automated failover, but the federal officials were barely listening. Their eyes kept drifting to me, watching how I monitored the system with quiet mastery, how every shift in the grid seemed to align with the subtle movements of my hand. The moment the demonstration ended, applause broke out, not polite, not corporate, but genuine. Then came the twist. A senior official from the Department of Energy approached me directly. Not Reed, not the board, not even Evan. "Mr. Drake," he said, extending a hand. "We'd like to discuss a federal partnership directly with you. Not with Solance, with me." Behind him, Evan's face collapsed into something hollow. Talia stared forward like someone watching a train she couldn't stop. And for the first time in a long while, power didn't feel like revenge. It felt like alignment, like stepping into the role I was always meant to hold. Triumph, quiet and absolute. The day after the federal demo, Solance issued a company-wide announcement at 7:30 in the morning. It was a sterile, carefully edited statement, the kind written by lawyers who are terrified of adjectives. But it said everything it needed to say in 3 blunt sentences, effective immediately. Evan Lockridge has resigned. CFO Talia Renshaw will transition to a non-executive role. Solance appoints Mason Drake as Chief Systems Architect, reporting directly to the board. The emails started flooding my inbox within minutes, some congratulatory, some shocked, some quietly relieved. I read none of them. Instead, I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking a cup of coffee I didn't have to rush, letting the weight of the previous 48 hours settle in my bones. Solance was shifting around me, not because I fought for a title, but because the truth finally forced the company to rearrange itself into something resembling logic. By the time I arrived at headquarters, employees were lined along the glass corridor pretending to check their phones, but clearly waiting for me. No one said my name out loud, yet everyone's eyes landed on me, the way you look at a pressure valve that finally stopped the explosion you were bracing for. I nodded politely and kept walking. No victory lap, no parade, just quiet forward motion. In the engineering wing, I found Carter Wynn standing beside my old desk, now polished, reorganized, and inexplicably decorated with a small welcome back card. The moment he saw me, he straightened like a soldier facing inspection. "Mason," he began, his voice small, "I owe you an apology. For everything. For the idea I took. For the things I said. I let the silence linger, not to punish him, but because it finally felt deserved." "I know," I said simply. "Let's just make sure the work is better than the past." He nodded quickly, grateful for forgiveness he hadn't earned but desperately needed. Minutes later, the board convened in the executive conference room and greeted me with unexpected warmth. Howard Mercer gestured for me to sit at the head of the table. "The company needs stable leadership," he said. "We'd like you to consider stepping in as interim CEO. A few years ago, I might have said yes out of loyalty, obligation, or the naive belief that title equaled influence. But now, after everything Solance had shown me, after the politics, the secrecy, the negligence dressed as strategy, I felt nothing but clarity. No," I said gently. "I don't want the CEO chair. I want freedom to build, not paperwork to drown in." There was a pause, then a surprising calm washed across the room. Howard nodded. "Then we'll give you full technical authority and no political burden. You'll oversee everything that touches the grid engine. That's where the real power is anyway." He wasn't wrong. As I left the boardroom, I felt no triumph, no smugness, just a steady, grounded certainty. This wasn't revenge, it was realignment, quiet domination through competence, not noise, and for the first time in years. The company finally moved around me instead of over me. When the board meeting adjourned, I didn't linger. I gathered my things, what little Solance had boxed up for me 2 days earlier, and headed toward the main lobby. It was almost poetic, walking the same path where I'd once been ushered out in silence, a disposable relic of legacy thinking. This time, there was no silence waiting for me. The moment I stepped into the hallway, people rose from their desks as if pulled by the same current. Some nodded, some smiled quietly, some looked down, ashamed of how they'd stayed silent when Evan humiliated me. I didn't blame them. I'd lived long enough to understand fear inside a corporate building can be stronger than conscience. I kept moving, steady and unhurried, letting the moment breathe. No triumphal march, no savior's glow, just the simple dignity of a man who had reclaimed the ground beneath his own feet. When I reached the glass doors, sunlight spilled across the floor, bright and warm, far brighter than it had seemed the day I left. Outside, the morning air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just honest. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the city move around me, cars, voices, footsteps, all ordinary and alive. For the first time in a long time. I wasn't thinking about deadlines or outages or the weight of a system resting on my shoulders. I wasn't thinking about Evan or Talia or the years spent patching holes other people pretended didn't exist. I was thinking about the quiet power of starting again. Then my phone buzzed. A new email. From Department of Energy, National Integration Division. I opened it slowly, half expecting a follow-up from yesterday's demo. Instead, it was an invitation, formal, intentional, unmistakably direct. They wanted me to join a federal consortium dedicated to redesigning the national smart grid framework, not as a consultant through Solance, not as an employee under anyone's hierarchy. They wanted me independently, my system, my vision, my rules. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Freedom didn't roar, it unfolded. As I stepped off the final stair and onto the sidewalk, a single thought settled over me with gentle clarity. I wasn't walking away from Solance, I was walking toward myself. The version of me I'd buried under late nights, missed milestones, and quiet sacrifices. The version who still believed in building something that mattered. If there's anything these last days taught me, it's this: sometimes getting pushed out isn't the end. It's the clearing of a doorway you were meant to walk through. Your worth doesn't disappear just because someone fails to see it. It waits, patient and steady, until the day you finally claim it. And if you're listening to this, tell me, where are you watching from? Your story matters too. If this moment resonated with you, feel free to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Every click is a quiet nod of solidarity and a reminder that none of us walk these roads alone.